So thank you all. Those of you that were here this morning, thank you. And if you were here this morning, thanks. And if you're new, thank you also for coming. We'll do the door prize drawing for plants when both Tony and Kara have spoken. I'm going to get us going, and then Mark Dunham of Natural Resources is going to introduce both Tony and Kara. And so when I'm through, I will turn the floor over to Mark. I do want to make an announcement. Iris Tate, who is here in the audience, here's Iris. She has some wild ferns that she would like to share. She thinks maybe she can accommodate 3 or 4 people. But when we take our break, just meet her up here by the door and check with her and make your arrangements to get with her if you want any of her ferns. Okay. As soon as Kara is finished with her talk on how to set up a Cherokee garden, some of you may know that we do have a garden already in the ground and growing between the Tribal Council House and Human Resources. So those of you that would like to, Pat and Mark are going to walk us over there immediately as soon as the talks are over. We'll look at them, and that will be, again, that will be everything that we'll do today. Again, for those of you that want to go on the nature walk in the morning, we'll leave from in front of this building at 9:30, okay? So I think without further ado, Mark, if you would like to come down, I'll turn the floor over to Mark Dunham of Natural Resources.
No applause for me. I'm just introducing our next speaker. Anyway, our next speaker was born and raised in Muskogee, and he graduated from NSU. It's been a few years ago now, but anyway. He is a Cherokee Nation citizen, but now he and his wife, Kara, live in Marietta, Georgia, and they are both master gardeners. But Mr. Harris received his bachelor's degree in education from Northeastern State and then attended the Johnson International School of Business Management. And from there, he became the zone manager for the worldwide professional division of the SC Johnson Company and was responsible for a fourth of the North American operation before he retired after 30 years. And since then, he has become a master gardener through the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences from the University of Georgia. And he is a member of the Georgia Native Plant Society and also a member of the Society of Ethnobiology. Although he is not published, he has compiled a comprehensive list of 450 plants and trees that the Cherokees use for medicine, food, shelter, tools, weapons, and ceremonial purposes prior to the Trail of Tears. So if you would, our next speaker, Mr. Tony Harris.
Thank you, Mark. And I trust everyone had a great lunch. I really get excited when I have the opportunity to speak to people about ethnobotany and also how it interfaced with the Cherokee people. And I've titled the presentation today, If Plants Could Talk, a Cherokee Relationship. And the reason I say that is that if we truly listen, plants will talk to us. They'll tell us what they like. They'll tell us what they will give us. They'll tell us what they'll take. And if we truly listen, we can develop a relationship to them just as our ancestors did. Someone asked me one time, why do you want to do this? Because I'm involved in actually helping to develop 3 different Cherokee gardens at the present time, one at our personal residence, one at a Cobb County park in Marietta, and also helping to bring plants out here for the Cherokee Heritage Garden here. And I've had people ask me, why do you do that? And I guess the reason is that these plants, if left in the wild on their own, would soon disappear. And some of them have. But if they're brought together in a relatively small area in an educational type garden where people can come in and learn about how the plants were used, how the Cherokees used them, the significance of the plants, then our heritage tends to come to life again. And I think this is especially true and important for younger people, because if this skips another generation, we're going to have a hard time, I think, going back and picking up and handing off to them what these plants meant to our ancestors. Because as I tell a lot of different groups that I speak to, some of them master gardeners, we garden because we enjoy it, because it's fulfilling. But the Cherokees, I mean, it was survival. That's what they depended on for survival. So I hope as we go through this presentation today, you'll take away some things and kind of a taste of what the Cherokees, how they use the plants and the significance of them. One of the hardest things to do was to go through and break this down to just a few plants and or trees, because I've got a list now of probably 650, and in our personal garden we've got close to 400 already planted. So I'm hoping that I give you a good cross-section today that will give you a feel for how these plants were used. And if you have any questions as we go through, feel free to just raise your hand. The first thing I want to talk about is changing plants into medicine. And you say, well, what do you mean? Well, let me start off. I think this was brought up this morning. What I'm giving you is not what I'm saying you should go out and do. What I'm giving you is an historical perspective of how the Cherokees used these plants. I remember my mother using some of these plants when I was growing up. She'd make stuff that she'd say, well, and I didn't know what it was. She said, well, drink this. And you drink it. Some of it would taste better than others. But you would drink it, and she'd use it, but I had no idea what was in it. But I wanted to, as we go through, make you aware of how the Cherokees prepared some of these formularies for medicine. The first way is in what they call a decoction. So when you hear me use that word decoction, what that means is that the plant material is placed in a large amount of water, which is partially boiled away. So that's how they used a decoction. The next was steep, or what's known as infusion. And there the plant material is either shredded or chopped up, and it's soaked normally in cold water. Then they used what's known as a poultice. And a poultice was where they took the plant material after it was being prepared in certain ways, in one of different ways, and they wrapped it in cloth and applied it to the affected area. Then, of course, they used they boiled some of the materials. The plant material was boiled for a short time in some water. And then, last but not least, they made teas. And in most cases, the teas they would drink. But sometimes they were applied to the affected spot that they wanted to treat. Now, in some cases, the patient was scratched with material like the devil's walking stick, which has thorns, which are mightier than any rose bush I've ever seen. But they would scratch the affected area and then pour that tea or medication on it to help absorb it into the skin. Now then, this is a picture of Blue Ridge, Georgia, the homeland. And the reason I included this picture in there is that I wanted to give you an idea of the topography of what the land back east looked like, because it's important to keep that in focus when we're talking about the plants that's going to be presented today. Georgia is blessed with a tremendous number of trees. As a matter of fact, even in the city of Atlanta, they've estimated that close to 80% of the city is what they call under canopy, under the shade of trees, which is more than any other major city in the United States. But you get up into North Georgia and you really get into the trees and the forest. that our ancestors thrived in. Now, when we talk about trees, I wanted to talk about in general how some trees were used. Some trees were used they were called directional trees. And what you see here is a picture of a tree taken within the city limits of Marietta, Georgia, in a residential neighborhood. And you notice how the tree has been tended in such a way that it grew like it was pointing in a direction, which is exactly what it was doing. And these were known as living signposts. Now, they normally pointed to a water source or a suitable river crossing or even main trails. But you notice on this particular plant, the knob, what I call the elbow, you know the knot out there? That is significant because that knot at a right angle signifies that there's water in that direction. Now, if you were in Marietta, you would see where that does indeed point to a stream, a brook going through the city of Marietta. So the Cherokees would use that in a directional, and not only directions, but what it meant. These trees were trained. Is that better? Okay, I'm sorry. These trees were trained at a very early age as they were saplings. And they obviously had to be because they were normally white oak. Someone asked me, well, why did they use white oak? And I've had a couple of people tell me that they felt that they used the white oak because it would give a uniformity to the type of tree that was used for directional purposes, so that the Cherokees knew that it wasn't just a fluke thing out there. It was, if it was a white oak, and they saw this, they knew that that was a legitimate directional tree. Now, at the present time, there's over 2,000 of these trees still in existence in the southeast. North Georgia is blessed with a lot of them. We really enjoy getting out in North Georgia and seeing the things that the Cherokees made in years gone by, which are still in existence, and they're still there. Now, if you're interested in these directional trees, there's a website that's called mountainstewards.org/Georgia for more information on the Trail Tree project. And some people have a real interest in it, and you can get a lot more information on that particular website. So having talked about how trees were used sometimes in general, let's talk about in specific. And the first tree I want to talk about is the black walnut. They call it the Juglans nigra. And now you're going to see when I go through this presentation, these different plants, I'm going to give you, that's a Latin name. And to learn these things, I really got tongue-tied on some of them. But it's important, especially if you want to create your own Cherokee garden, to realize that you want to go by this name. And you say, well, where do you get that? You'll notice up here I've got a set of books, and Daniel Moorman, Professor Moorman, is one of the world's most renowned ethnobotanists. He's got 3 books up here. If you will look that particular plant up, it'll give you that Latin name. That Latin name tells you that that species is native. It's not a cultivar. It's not a knockoff of a native plant. So if you want to be true in what you put in your garden, always go by the Latin name. And you can't, in other words, you can't go out in the box stores and buy these plants. You have to go out in the woods and find them and dig them up. That's how we found these. And we would go out in the heat and the sleet and the mosquitoes and the brooks and the mud. And we would find them along with the Georgia Native Plant Society, which, by the way, the Cherokee people have a lot of friends in the Georgia Native Plant Society. And we would put them in our nursery until they got to this size. And they would be ready to to be planted in the ground. Some people say, well, how do you know when a plant like this is ready to put in the ground? Well, you can take it, and if you take that plant and turn it over and hit it where it'll come out of the container, and if you'll look in there, if you see a lot of white roots, you've done a good job. It's ready for the ground, and it's ready to be planted. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about drought, heat, and all that stuff, and what you can do in creating your own garden and how you can avoid some of the pitfalls in weather situations like that. But the black walnut, an infusion, was used of the inner bark was used to treat smallpox. Now, why is that important? Because, as all of us know, when the Cherokee were still back east, when our ancestors were back east, we went through 2 smallpox epidemics, which killed a vast number of our citizens. But this was one of the plants they used in treating smallpox. Now, the bark has to be used very carefully because it's very toxic. It's toxic, but they used it carefully. And you say, well, what's carefully? Well, in some instances, they would chew the bark for toothache. But it was also effective at that. Now, they wouldn't sit there and chew it like an all-day sucker. But they would chew it briefly to relieve the aches and pains of the toothache. And the sap was used very much like an antiseptic, especially to treat things like ringworm. And it's a very strong substance. Now, there was a poultice that was made from the husk. Everybody knows the black husk of the walnut. And if you have ever shredded a few of those in your hands are black when you finish. And it's hard to wash off. But a poultice was made from the husk and placed on the belly buttons of newborn babies to promote the umbilical cord dropping off. So there again, it was used medically as well. Also, the nuts were used as food. I personally love black walnuts. Now, they're very hard to open. We had a black walnut tree when I was growing up. In fact, we had an orchard. We had about 40 fruit trees. But we had a black walnut tree, and my father had a big vise out in the shop. And I'd take the black walnuts out there, and that's how I would crush them. It doesn't take long with a hammer to realize that's the smart way after you bang your fingers up a few times. Now, the black husk were used to make a dark brown dye. Sometimes we see this used to color baskets or clothing or whatever, but it made a very effective dark brown dye. Also, the leaves were used to make a green dye. Before the walnuts ripen, those husks are green, and so are the leaves. But the leaves were used to make a green dye. Now, the husks were used also. They would grind those up and mix that with various other liquids and let it, in essence, ferment. And then they would go out to a stream and pour that in the water. And it would shock, or some people say poison, but it would shock the fish. And the Cherokees would harvest the fish. Now, gigs, the Cherokees made gigs from this material. The walnut has a very dense, close-layered material. So it's very hard. As a matter of fact, today, some aircraft propellers are made out of walnut. But the Cherokees made weapons and tools out of the walnut as well. But the walnut tree emits something that's called juglone, Juglone. And it's emitted from the roots and also from the leaves and sometimes the sap. And if you've ever wondered, when you go out in the woods, why there's hardly anything growing under a walnut tree, is that a walnut tree is very selfish. It will omit nearly all of its competition. And so that's the reason why, if you have a walnut tree, don't plant your vegetable garden by it. Because it will do a number on your vegetable garden. It'll kill tomatoes, apples, potatoes, it'll even kill conifers. But that juglone is just a natural substance that the walnut emits. But just keep in mind, they don't go well with a vegetable garden. It likes full sun, so it'll go right out in the middle of the hottest, driest area that you've got. It does like moist, well-drained soils, and it can reach 130 foot tall. Now, the black walnuts can live for up to 250 years. Now, I'm doing this from memory. Not to say that I was around at that time, but I've heard I've heard that there is a walnut tree on the campus of Northeastern that dates back to 1859, the female seminary. Is that right, Julia? 1859, is that about the time? Anyway, I've heard that it goes back to about 1859, so it goes back a long way. It's a very old tree. And it was a big tree when I was going to school there. Okay. This is a Cherokee fish trap. This is in northwest Georgia. This is part of where our ancestors lived. This was taken on the Toccoa River in North Georgia. It was between Blue Ridge and the other town, Copper Hill. Copper Hill, half of Copper Hill is in Tennessee and half of Copper Hill is in Georgia. But the North Georgia Railroad runs right along this river. And this was taken from the train. Now you notice that is a Cherokee fish trap. And you say, well, what is a Cherokee fish trap? And that's where the Cherokees went out into the water and put these stones to direct the fish into a certain direction. Now, the reason I put this picture up here is, remember when we talked about the black walnut, how we talked about how the Cherokees made gigs out of them, and how they used the black husk to make a substance that would stun the fish? In my mind's eye, when I saw this, I had to take the picture. Because in my mind's eye, I thought I could just see the Cherokee out there with gigs and or that slurry harvesting fish. This is still here today. Normally, the water is not quite that high. But you'll notice there's a dock out there, a patio, if you, so to speak, that someone has built. And there's a house back there. It's encroachment of civilization into areas that once were so pristine, and you didn't see anything like this. But this is still here, and it's quite impressive. As a matter of fact, this top circle will go all the way to that other bank, and the only through water is through this area right down here, a small area. But they would get out there and drive the fish up in those areas and harvest them. And so I had to include that when I was after talking about the black walnut. The next one is the shagbark hickory. Can anybody tell me why it's called shagbark hickory? Well, it's called Acaria ovata, and there's one planted. I brought one from Georgia, and we planted it in February, I guess it was. And it's out here. So when we go outside, you'll be able to see this little shagbark hickory. Now, the reason I want you to look at it is that you're not going to see the shagbark. Because when the shagbark hickory is younger, they don't have this shaggy bark. They only develop that when the tree is older. So how do you tell a shagbark hickory from a regular hickory? It's the leaves. And if you'll look at the leaves on the shagbark hickory out here, each leaflet has 5. They have 5 leaflets, 3 and then 2. So that's how you tell the shagbark hickory when it's real young and it doesn't have its shaggy bark yet. The shaggy bark hangs from the trunk. Each leaf has 5 leaflets, as I mentioned. Now, the Cherokee made a tea from the inner bark that was used to treat colds and fever. So they would go in and scrape that inner bark and make a tea out of it. Also, the nuts of the shagbark hickory were very oily. So the Cherokees would crush these and extract the oil and use it for cooking. So they would not only eat the nuts, but they would also use the oil to cook with as well. Now the sap, this surprises some people, the sap was used to make a hickory syrup. How many people have tasted hickory syrup? I like it. I think it's quite tasty. Most people say, well, when they think of syrup, they think of maple syrup. But there's a hickory syrup, and it's quite tasty. Now, this was the wood of choice for smokehouses. Our ancestors, nearly all of them, had smokehouses. They'd smoke anything. They'd smoke those fish they got out of the river. They'd smoke wild game. This was a way of preserving. Well, this wood was a wood of choice in their smokehouses. It has a high heat value, a high BTU, but it burns evenly in a steady heat, and everybody knows hickory smoke makes everything taste better. Now, they used it for making bows and also stickball sticks because it was hard. It was very hard, very dense, close layered, fibrous wood. It is sun tolerant, and it can reach 70 to 80 feet tall. Now the next one is the tulip poplar. Some people call it the tulip tree. And it's the Liriodendron tulipifera. And the Cherokees, the tulip-shaped trees would form at the top of the tree. Sometimes, unless you're in the spring, unless you're really looking up there, the first thing you'll notice about them blooming is when the blooms have fallen off and they're on the ground. But they'll bloom in the very top of the trees. And you'll see that the trunk itself, picture of this tree, is pretty bare until it gets towards the top, and then it begins to branch out. Now, this particular tree right here this picture was taken in one of our lower gardens. And this particular tree is about 10 foot in circumference. And it's about between 140 and 150 foot tall. So they get to be massive trees. One of these trees is planted in the garden out here as well. Now the leaves were used as a poultice for sores and to apply to inflammations. And the leaf buds were used as a salve for burns. But the Cherokees, probably the most recognized use of this particular tree, is the fact that the Cherokees made canoes out of it. And don't ask me how they got a section of that down unless the thing had fallen. But they'd take a section of it, and they would burn and scrape and burn. It's a very laborious process to make a canoe over a long period of time. But it was one of the woods of choice to make canoes. Now the buds were used as an infusion for arthritis. And as I say, it can grow to well over 100 foot tall. And believe it or not, it's the state tree of Tennessee. And it's also in the magnolia family. Now, who would have thought that? But in the magnolia family. Now let's leave trees for a minute and get into some shrubs. The first one I want to talk about is 7-bark hydrangea. This is Hydrangea arborescens. And this is the native hydrangea. It's not the Annabelle hydrangea. The native hydrangea is a Hydrangea arborescens. This particular picture was taken in a lower garden of ours. And it seems to like it where it's at. You can see it gets filtered sun there. And we put it along one of the pathways. But they don't get as large as your regular hydrangeas, but the flowers on them are very delicate, and I think fragrant when they bloom. But the inner bark was used to treat vomiting in children, and the bark was also used for sore or swollen muscles, and they would sometimes they would boil that and put that warm solution on the swollen muscles as kind of a treatment. Sometimes they make a tea. Now, the poultice of the scrape bark was used for burns. And the bark was chewed for stomach trouble and high blood pressure. So this particular plant has a lot of uses. As a matter of fact, we have one. It's right here. And some lucky person is going to be able to go home with that today, as long as they promise to take good care of it. Now, the tea from the inner bark and leaves was used as a stimulant. So not only did they use ginseng as a pick-me-up, but they also used this as a stimulant as well. Now, it's found in moist soil and under a forest canopy close to streams. Now, you don't find this plant around here very often. You'll find them back east. You'll find them in the Smoky Mountains, along the trails there. And in fact, they grow profusely there. But they make a magnificent specimen in a grouping of 3 when they're blooming. Now, the stem bark tends to peel off in several different layers and colors, and hence the name, the 7-bark hydrangea, because over the growing season, it will take on 7 different appearances. And so when the Cherokees, when they looked at this, that's the 7-bark hydrangea. Now, whenever you see that word, arborescens, the second word in the Latin name, all that means is becoming tree-like. So if you see the word arborescens, it means it becomes tree-like. And the 7-bark hydrangea does, because as it gets older, its wood gets its stems get kind of woody. The next one is Arrowwood viburnum. I've got 2 pictures here. And the reason I wanted to cover some viburnums is that you really don't have those back here. We have plants back east that you don't have here. That's why I'm interested in bringing some of those here. I don't have an Arrowwood viburnum with us, but it's very much self-explanatory. It's Viburnum dentidum. And what did they use it for? Well, the Cherokees used it to make arrow shafts because the shafts were very straight. Now, you'll notice in the top picture, you'll see the aerial portions of the plant. But in the bottom picture, even though it's shady, you can see where those reeds are very straight. And that's what they would make arrow shafts out of. This particular plant grows, you'll find it in eastern Alabama, northwest Georgia. It grows very well along the rocky shoals of the Coosa River up near Rome, Georgia. It is on the federal endangered species list. And what this plant does, it does what they call colonize. In other words, it will spread out, kind of like cane, or bamboo colonizes. It'll put out new shoots and get to be a bigger and bigger plant around the base where it goes into the ground. So the Cherokees would harvest these and make arrow shafts out of them. Now, the fruit attracts birds. So if you're a bird watcher, they love the Arrowwood viburnum. It does well in the full shade, or full sun, and is very cold hardy. So it can go through some real cold weather as well. It does like to be near water. As I mentioned, it grows well along the Coosa River. And it's in the honeysuckle family. So surprisingly, some of the things that when we hear about a plant, we're surprised at what family they fall into. Next is the maple leaf viburnum, and this is a picture of one taken in our upper garden. It's a Viburnum acerifolium, and that's this plant right here. Now, this is a fine specimen, and it will, over time, colonize as well, and it'll get bigger and spread. But this one's ready for the ground. It's a real good specimen. We got that on a plant rescue where they were going to build a water reservoir. The county was going to build a water reservoir, and they let us go in and rescue these plants. Let me just say something about that right now. we work very closely with the Georgia Native Plant Society. You have a society here in Oklahoma called the Oklahoma Native Plant Society. And I looked online, and it appears that the closest office is Tulsa. But if you're interested in hunting plants and you need help in hunting plants, you know what you want because you've gone to the books and you found the Latin name. You know the native species that you want. The people in those societies, those plant societies, are very knowledgeable. We have people in our group that have 30 and 35 years experience going out and hunting native plants. And when we shared with them what we were doing in creating Cherokee Gardens, their response was, well, tell us what you need. Give us the Latin name. Tell us what you need, and we will help you find it. So if you get involved with your Oklahoma Native Plant Society, they're going to be a tremendous help in helping you find the native plants that you need to put into your garden. Now, a compound infusion of this was taken for smallpox. Again, here is another plant that the Cherokees used for smallpox. And again, that was such a tragedy that took place twice in the Cherokee history, was those outbreaks of smallpox. Now, the root bark tea was taken to promote sweating. And you say, to promote what? To promote sweating, to help reduce fever. Have you ever heard people say, well, I think I'm going to go in and sweat off this cold, or go up and wrap in a hot blanket and sweat this cold off? I've done it. It works. And I've broken fevers doing that. My mother has done that. I don't know if she gave me stuff to drink too. I'm not for sure exactly what was in that, but it made you sweat. And so they used it for that purpose as well. As again, I say, it was used to reduce fever.
Tony, what do you mean by infusion? I know that means steep, but how do they take that for smallpox? Is it going to be oral? Is that what you mean by infusion?
Yeah. Normally, if it was for that purpose, it would be taken orally. Yeah.
Okay. And that's what you mean by infusion? Or?
Yeah. And sometimes they would scratch the skin and apply it.
Okay.
Yeah. And infusion was taken to prevent spasms. So if they had muscle spasms, they would take it for that purpose as well. Now the fruits, the fruit that bear purple, black, what they call drupes. Does anybody know what a drupe is? Clint? No? Well, the best way to describe it, I guess, is it's a drupe and not a drop. A drop is a round berry, okay? A drupe looks more like a small pear, okay? It's the shape of it. So they're called drupes. And so it's unique when you see the fruit on that particular plant. Instead of calling it berries, they refer to it as drupes because it does droop. Now it can grow 3 to 6 feet tall. It tolerates full sun to part shade. Where we have it planted here in that particular garden, it's partial sun, about half a day in that particular section. It likes the medium moisture and well-drained soils. So if you're looking at a place to plant it, you would want to consider that as well. Let me say something, stop again and say something right here. I have a lot of people ask me, well, does this plant like sun? Or does this plant like shade? Where should I plant it? How should I plant it? You know, we mentioned about going on plant rescues with the Native Plant Society. And we're going to go on a hike tomorrow, and we're going to be looking at plants, and we're going to be pointing plants out to you that were significant. But I want to, how many's going tomorrow? Okay. I want you to promise me that you'll do something. Whenever a plant is pointed out to you, I want you to stop and let that plant talk to you. And what I mean by that is, if you'll look at that plant, say, okay, there it is, start looking around. How much sun is it getting? Is it thriving there? Are there more than one species, more than one plant of that type in a small area? How much sun does it get? How wet is the soil? What type of soil is it growing in? Does it like wet feet? Does it like dry feet? Does it grow on slopes? Is it growing next to a stream? If we will listen, the plant will tell us where it wants to be planted. It will tell us what it likes. And your success ratio, when you go home and plant this in your garden, is going to be much higher if you just kind of observe, as you dig these plants up, observe what the environment is in right now. When we dig up a plant, we take plastic bags, grocery bags, just a regular Kroger or Walmart or whatever they are, and we try to take a generous amount of soil that it's been in with it. And then when we get home, we put them in pots with a little bit of potting soil, unfertilized potting soil. And then we use rainwater. Now, we collect rainwater. We have rain barrels. And we have several rain barrels. But we feed them rainwater. We do not fertilize them. And some people say, well, what do you mean you don't fertilize them? Well, you got to realize they're already in shock. And they haven't had this Dairy Queen banana split out in the forest that you're about to give them with that fertilizer. Why send them into another state of shock? Just use regular potting soil without fertilizer. Now you say, well, what kind is that? Well, I like jungle growth. You can buy it anywhere. It's not expensive, but it doesn't have the fertilizer in it. So that would be the procedures I would use to hardy them off until they develop those white roots and they're ready to be put into the ground. The next bush, the Yaupon holly. Anybody familiar with Yaupon holly? Okay. Yaupon holly is Ilex vomitorius, and they have a reason for calling it that. Because it was used in a male purification process, male-only purification process, and unity rituals. The tea made from the leaves and stems became what is known as a black drink. And they would drink this material until they would vomit. That was part of the purification process. The ceremony included vomiting. And why did they do that? Because it has one of the highest caffeine levels of any plant in nature. And even as high or higher than most coffees. And so they would drink this black drink, and it was the caffeine, I feel certain, that made them, at least kept them up all night during the ceremonies. But it was something that was really it was kind of a male-only purification process. Now, the fruit was also used by black duck and grouse and quail and wild turkey, and they would eat that. But also, deer would come up and eat on the foliage as well. Now, the Cherokees knew this. And so, as these berries would ripen, and it would all come in about the same time. How many of you have a Cornus Florida, a dogwood? You notice that when the berries, one day the berries will still be red, but one day you won't find a bird in that tree at all. And the next day, every bird in 5 miles will be in that tree, and they will strip that tree of every red berry there. Well, these other animals knew that when the berries on the Yaupon holly were just ripe enough, they would come in and start eating them. Well, our ancestors knew that too. And so it was a very opportune time to get some game as well. Pretty easy pickings in some cases. So it was a time to fill the smokehouse as well. It is sun and drought tolerant. It would do well here in Oklahoma. It's one of those plants that if you planted it would do very well. The next one, American witch hazel. Humamelus virginiana. How many people have a witch hazel? Well, there's actually two. I brought two from Georgia. They're in the garden out here, so you'll have to see. One of them is about this tall. And witch hazel is a very unique plant. An infusion of the bark was taken for TB. It was also used as a tea for colds and fever and sore throats. An infusion was used to wash sores in skin places. How many have ever heard of witch hazel in the bottle? Yeah? Okay. And the bark collected on the Cherokees would use the bark collected on the eastern side of this bush because they felt like it made more powerful medicine. I don't know why. Don't ask me. I don't know why. But that's what I have heard. People tell me that they preferred to gather it off the eastern side of the bush. They can grow up to 20 foot tall. And it prefers rich, moist soils and requires extra water when it's been established. And it'll take the full sun, but it'll also take a little bit of shade as well. Now the next one is ginseng. And another name for ginseng is mountain climber. It's Panax quinquefolius. And what you want to be aware of is that there's different kinds of ginseng out there. There's an Asian ginseng, but the native ginseng is the one that our ancestors used. And as I have read as well, it was one of the few plants that the Cherokees brought on the Trail of Tears is highly prized. And one of the ways the Cherokees used ginseng was as a pick-me-up, just like a lot of other people use it today as well. Very much overhunted today. Ginseng on the black market will bring upwards of $400 a pound. So it's very over harvested. As I say, it's used as a pick-me-up. The poultice from the roots were used on boils. And a tea was made from the roots to treat headaches and cramps. And the roots were chewed and blown through a wooden tube onto an area of pain. That's one of the ways, another way a medicine was applied to the person was having it blown through a tube onto the affected area. The tea was also used to stimulate an appetite in the elderly and those with colds and flus and infections. Now, the next plant I want to talk about is Goldenseal. Some people call it orange root, and the reason I'm putting these two plants together is the Hydrastis canadensis. The reason I'm talking about these two plants together is that these two plants has what's known as a symbiotic relationship. You often find the Goldenseal planted next to the ginseng because the ginseng being more frail, the Goldenseal would help impart kind of a protection against diseases that the ginseng might be subject to picking up. So they had that symbiotic relationship. Now, it was also used as a topical antimicrobial. So it was a topical ointment as well. And it's taken internally for digestions and also as a laxative. And you could also gargle with that for canker sores. Used for sore eyes and also to treat TB. So it had a very broad use as a plant. And now the roots are yellow and knotted, but the stems, they're purple and hairy looking. And it's in the buttercup family. So again, who would have thought that? New Jersey tea. Who's familiar with New Jersey tea? Anyone? Okay. New Jersey tea is something that you don't. Well, you do find it around here. I think Pat said he knew of a place where you could find some. But the root tea was used to treat toothaches. And the hot root tea was used for bowel problems. Now, the Cherokee lore has it that when this bush is in bloom, the snakes will bite. And so that's just one of the tales out there that I've heard. I don't know, but it was interesting when I read that. It's very fire adaptive and has a prolific resprouter. In other words, these plants can go through a forest fire and be burned all the way down to the bare ground, and they'll come back. So it has a very prolific and aggressive root system that will allow it to reestablish itself even in those harsh conditions. As a matter of fact, this morning I think we were talking about, who was talking about picking the berries, the huckleberries, was it? Yeah, that was another one that, in fact, the Cherokees would not only every 3 or 4 years burn those down to the ground, or they would take and chop them down to the ground, because it would help the plants to become more prolific in the next growing season. Now, it's found in sandy soils and of woodlands and prairies and on hillsides. And it's very drought tolerant. It likes well-drained soils, and it'll take full sun. It'll grow right out next to an interstate. Now, cinnamon fern. I've included 2 different pictures here. Osmunda cinnamomea. And the reason that they call it cinnamon fern, if you'll look at the picture on the top, you'll see these nettles up there which look very much like cinnamon sticks. But that's actually their seed. And that's when they will drop their seeds. And these will propagate that way. I've had people ask me about this. They said, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but on all the plants that I have that propagate by seed naturally, they're just not spreading. I don't know what I'm doing. And I said, well, how are you weeding? And they said, well, I'm using preen. Anybody familiar with preen? P-R-E-E-N? It's that powder that you spread on the ground, and it's supposed to keep weeds from growing up. Well, it does work on weeds, but it'll also kill those seeds that propagate, those plants that propagate by seed. So I would never use that preen around any of your plants that you're wanting to have propagate by seed, because it will kill them and they'll never sprout. Also, just as a side there, how many of you grow plants from seed? Maybe start them off as seed. Try using your material that doesn't have a fertilizer in it. For instance, your jungle growth, because some seed species, fertilizer will actually inhibit the sprouting of the seed. So you'll have a better crop if you're growing from seed and then transplanting into the garden. If you'll use soil that's not laden with fertilizer. Now, the Cherokees would crush these roots and boil them and apply them in warm solutions to to their hands for arthritis. And the roots were chewed and applied to snake bites. But at the same time, they would also swallow a small portion of that material before they spit the rest of it out. But they would use it for snake bites, swallow a little bit of it before they spit the rest of it out. Now, the early fronds, you know what those are? When these leaflets first come out, when they're small, the Cherokees would eat those. They were edible. They were cooked as a vegetable in the spring. And also, how many of you know what a fiddlehead is? You know, when some ferns come out, they'll come out and it looks like the top portion looks like a small gyro wrap. Looks like a small gyro. But it's actually before the leaves, spread and it furls out. Those particular, what they call fiddleheads, are edible. And they say it tastes like a blend of broccoli, asparagus, and artichoke. So if you catch them at the right time, those are edible, and you just steam them like you would any of those other vegetables, and they'll try it sometime. And as I said, the seed spikes are cinnamon colored, and that's where it got its name. Now, they're found in shady, moist habitats like creeks and rivers and bogs and so forth. And these would do well along that creek out here where they're putting in the Cherokee garden. As long as most ferns, as long as they have plenty of water, can take some sun. But the sun with little water, and they go bad real quick. Okay. There's a couple of other things I wanted to mention to you that's concerning medicinal use. And by the way, those are our grandchildren. That's Emily and Zachary. And it looks like Emily is trying to keep Zachary out of trouble. But that's our two grandchildren. There were other plants that the Cherokees used. The Silex humilis, prairie willow, which is out here, and there's a nice stand of it. Prairie willow. The Cherokees referred to that plant as the plant that walks. And the reason they did is that the plant has very aggressive rhizome roots. That's the roots, okay? And it may have been found here this year, but next year it may pop up over here 6 or 8 feet. Very aggressive rhizome roots. So the Cherokees referred to it as the plant that got up and walked. The plant that walks. Now, the willow has a very interesting history in that the Cherokees used this as early as the early 1700s. And they would chew the leaves for toothache. They'd make a tea out of the leaves and the roots and sometimes the stems, and drink it for fever and colds and chills and aches and pains and whatever. And they used it for the longest time. And then in the 1860s, there was a little German company that started studying what was naturally taking place in that plant. And they synthesized what was naturally occurring in that plant. And they came up with a product called Bayer aspirin. Salicylic acid. Some people call it acetylsalicylic acid. But the Cherokees were using it correctly. And so isn't it amazing? And I don't know if it's through trial and error or how, but over hundreds of years, decades, our ancestors found what would work and what wouldn't work. You know, when you look at the number of plants used by the Cherokees for medicine food, it numbers, I guess, close to 750. And the formularies for some of these medicines were very complex in that it took a combination of sometimes 3, 4, or 5 different plants mixed together to come up with one formula. And it would take a Cherokee medicine man 15 to 20 years to become competent in these formularies. And so they were very complex. It wasn't just kind of a hit and miss trial and error type thing. It was very involved. And so when you're talking about Cherokee medicinal plants and usages, it's a very complex science, and one that I think our people can be very proud of, because we taught a lot of the settlers how to use a lot of medicine that they would be in deep trouble if they had not known about. But we've talked about a lot of plants, and I've done most of the talking, but I want to open it up to some questions now. Yeah.
Tony, that last subject you talked about, I mean, I've dealt with dairy cows and horses and livestock, and I mean, no one teaches them where to go to get their medicine. They innately, they know where to go. Like where I live, I don't have to introduce any medicine to them. I just let them out the gate, and they go in the wild, and they find what they need to eat to take care of any digestive problem. They can even worm themselves by using the proper plants. But the thing is, they're not taught that. And I'm thinking that, you know, after generation after generation after generation, I would think that innately, if you're really close to your environment and to your world, and you can't run to the pharmacy every day like we do now, I think we can get back in touch with what would heal us. And I think there's a guiding light that can direct us to what we need to eat. I think our body's receptive to that. What do you think?
Well, your first point, as far as animals are concerned, they do have an innate sense of what they should eat and not eat. For instance, deer. Now, where we live, we had to put up a fence, a steel fence. It looks like wrought iron, but it's heavy gauge black steel. It's 7 foot tall, and in our lower gardens, it's terraced down there. We had to run it along the terraces, so a deer would have to jump flat-footed 12 to 13 feet to clear that fence. We had to do that because they were eating everything. Our property butts up against the Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park, and the older deer chased the young deer out, and they were eating up everything. But we also know there are certain plants that deer won't eat, and like asilbe, like Lenten roses, like daffodils, because if they eat enough of those, it'll kill them. But they know it. So we plant those outside the fence because with the national park there, they still got plenty of food. But I don't know why that is so. I know that deer don't have gallbladders. That may be part of the reason. But the deer really don't have the upper teeth. It's more like a hard gum. And if you ever go out and you see something having eaten on your plants where it looks like it's ripped like this, probably a deer, because they'll take it and rip it like this. But they know, and they won't touch it. I've even planted some of those plants around plants that they love to eat, and they'll leave those alone too. So you learn to the ways that animals think too, because if they even smell some of those plants, they won't eat anything around them. So yeah, there's a lot of medicine today that we owe to plant research, and it's something that I don't claim to be an expert on. It's just that I enjoy the plants and how they were used, and to maybe give some historical perspective on it. But we have a rich history, one that we can be proud of, and we can carry on and hope to carry on and teach our children. I have a real interest. One of my hopes is that this garden out here will create an interest in younger Cherokees to possibly go into horticulture. and possibly to learn more about their Cherokee heritage, but what these plants mean to them. And so that's passing on all of our heritage to our children. And that's so important. Somebody else had a question. Yeah.
You said deer won't eat a stilby and daffodils. What was the third one?
Lenten roses.
And fern.
And what?
And fern.
Yeah.
Deer generally do not eat fern.
Generally, they won't eat a fern unless they're starving. Yeah. If a deer is starving, they'll eat anything. Rose bushes, thorns, and all. Yeah. Uh-huh.
How did they get the oil from the hickory nuts?
They crush them.
And then
They were very oily. So they would take that and crush them and then extract the oil and use that for cooking. When I say oily, it's very oily. But you handle those and your hands are kind of greasy. The nuts are okay. I prefer the black walnut myself. Anybody else? Yeah.
I was just going to comment, in the Joyce Kilmer Forest, which I think is near Asheville, North Carolina, there's a grove of tulip poplars that is really striking, and they are. We had to take binoculars. I mean, I immediately recognized the bark because we have a pair of tulip poplars at our home, and they leaf out first and bloom later, so it's like early May when it blooms. But I immediately we were just hiking on the trail, and I first recognized the bark. And then knew how high they could grow and how straight in forestry. But we had to take binoculars to see they had that unique leaf shape, the truncate, real unique leaf shape. So we took binoculars to confirm what it was.
They go a long way up here. And one of the giveaways is that they go a long way before they have any significant limbs. So they expose a lot of trunk before you see any limbs. And we have quite a bit of virgin timber on our property, being next to the park. And we also have a lot of visitors. Most people are surprised that Kennesaw Mountain National and Battlefield Park has more visitors every year than Yellowstone. But the reason is that it's close to a major metropolitan area. And I think all of them use burnt hickory, burnt hickory road. But it's a beautiful area that we fell in love with. Again, it's fun to go up into North Georgia and find some of the things that our ancestors left, and they're still there. And if you look around, and you'll find things like the fish diversion rocks in streams, the trees. You'll find occasionally you'll find a place where they milled arrows and weapons, and one way to determine if that's because it looks like from the way the rocks are smoothed out, you can tell almost like they were beating on them and so forth. But if you take a trowel or whatever and dig down in there, a lot of times you'll find either reject arrowheads or whatever. You'll know that was indeed where they milled some of their weapons. Yeah.
What's the temperature like in Georgia? I mean, is it similar to Oklahoma? I mean, I know it's really hot and we can go without rain here, but what's it like in Georgia?
Well, the planting zones are pretty close together. That's why I have always claimed that even though we have plants back east that you don't have here, that I think I can get anything that grows back east to grow here if they're planted in the right situation, in the right amount of water. And you know, I spoke earlier about the drought, and that's on everyone's minds. They say, well, why should I go out and plant something in this dry soil, you know, and have to water it and so forth? Well, I can give you a couple of little tricks. We hunt plants year-round. In the heat of summer, we'll come back, we'll put them in pots, we'll feed them rainwater. But when we get ready to plant them, we go down to Walmart And we go to the automotive department and buy a substance called oil dry. And oil dry is what garages use to soak up oil off the garage floors. But that particular brand only, the OIL-DRI, is all made out of natural materials, which means that it's going to become part of the earth again after a period of time. I take it, you can get a 40-pound bag for like $4. I take it and I'll pour a good bit of that into a 5-gallon bucket, and I'll load that bucket up with water. And at a minimum, let it set overnight, hopefully all day, until that material cannot absorb another iota of water. No more water. It's totally saturated. And then when we get ready to plant, we will take, when it's real dry, we like to dig a little extra large hole too and loosen that soil up in a bigger, larger diameter. But we'll take the oil dry, and depending on the size of the plant we're planting, we might put a cup, we might put 2 cups mixed in with the soil that we're going to put around that plant. And what that does is that it holds the water next to the roots. And any subsequent water that you put on there is going to absorb and hold it next to the roots. The roots can still take it out of the oil dry. But what it does, it helps keep moisture next to the root system, which is so important when you've got heat and a drought situation. We have over 300 master gardeners in Cobb County. And when we first started doing this, you could go to Walmart and they might have a bag or 2 of this on the shelf, and now you go in, you might find a pallet there. And they're probably thinking, they're wondering why their oil sales aren't greater, because people must be changing their own oil, you know. But it's a trick that helps. And any other questions? Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about the situations in which you go and do a plant rescue?
Okay. What we do, the Georgia Native Plant Society, we have close relationships with developers. So on commercial land, for instance, they may be building a water reservoir over here, or they may be going to build a medical center over here. But it may be 12 months, year and a half before they know they're going to break ground. But we also know they're going to go in and bulldoze everything. And so we have built up, and all native plant societies do this, even the one here in Oklahoma, have built up a relationship with developers where they go in and say, okay, we know you all are legit. We know you're not going to destroy our land. If we dig up a little hole with a plant, we'll level it back out. We're very, very considerate of our guests. And they will let us go in and rescue all the native plants that we want. Now, the Georgia Native Plant Society has rules. And one of the rules is you never can sell the native plant. Now, you can give them away. You can put them in gardens like we're doing. But it's just an absolute no-no to sell the native plants if you've gone out and rescued them. But it's a good way to learn from other people. If you feel like you're a novice and you don't know all the ins and outs, just remember to get the Latin name out of your books. And don't be afraid. They'll know what they are by Latin name. And they'll help you find them. And you'll be surprised how fast you can build up your garden. We've gone out before and brought back as many as 8 to 10 different species that were on our list in one trip. And so there's a lot of good friendships you build in there too. And people really buy in. They found out what we wanted to do and they said, tell us what you need. And we tell them, and there may be 12 of us out there on that hunt. I've got it over here. I've already dug it up for you, Tony. And so they help you locate those plants. I hope that helps. Huh? Yeah. That's right. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Now that I have not tasted. You have to make me some of that. Huh? Ask her. How do you make it?
It's a long process.
Yeah. Sounds like a break topic. So, do we have any other questions? Yeah, back here.
About 4 weeks ago, in Virginia, we went to the Smoky Mountains. We had a rock in the mountains. We stayed there for 2 weeks. Okay, we were driving down the Jeeps and everything. And I was down there getting water fresh out of those streams. Then I found some wild plums, growing along the trail we was on. And those guys didn't even know what I was doing. I was over with the nephew of mine. He said, "Well, I told you I was in here from Oklahoma." But I could say I was seeing wild, like sassafras tea. I could smell it. I was in them trails when I moved back to see the bush. And when I started eating that watercress one day, there was eating the grass. It's a good use for salad. You use that for salad nowadays. And I act like I was really eating wild stuff. That's all I was eating wild stuff rather than eat something, I think that's some sin. It's like wild plums. We used to get wild plums at the Camp River, I first had. And that's where we had to hunt blackberries. There was grown blackberries there when I was growing up. Make the room look small. Hatch that big.
It's interesting when you said that. I thought I often get asked the question in making presentations. The subject will get off on mushrooms, and they'll say, "Well, how do I know if a mushroom I find is edible?" And my standard answer is, if you have to ask that question, you need to buy them out of the grocery store. Because you don't fool around. You don't fool around with mushrooms unless you know what you're doing. But you don't venture out. That's not one of those that looks right. Yeah.
Our ancestors didn't have gardens.
Have a what?
Have gardens per se until relatively recently. Since contact at least. Why did they eat? I'm assuming they didn't grow gardens like we think of them.
Well, I tell you, if you'll go to North Georgia, Minnesota, some of the other areas up there, they've got some areas where you can go in and they'll have. It's not a fully developed little farm. But now Julia can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm doing this from memory. The average Cherokee farm would be maybe 8 or 10 acres. A lot of times they would have fruit trees, smokehouse. A lot of times they were situated next to rivers or streams or water, so they could have fish. They either hunted or sometimes raised their own meat. And I didn't think, that didn't come home to me until I went up there and saw that. And they had their own smokehouse. And with the exception of the smokehouse, that's how I was raised. We had enough land where we had an orchard, about 30 or 40 different types of fruit trees. We raised our own hay. The only thing we didn't have is a smokehouse. We had 10 hives of bees, which I maintained from 9 years old up. We had our own chickens and cows, and we raised our own beef. But with the exception of the smokehouse, it hit me like a ton of bricks when I saw that. And I don't know that my father was conscious of that or knew about that, or if that was just something that was just instinct. But before the Trail of Tears, the Cherokees were agricultural. They lived very close to the earth, and they did raise crops. And as a matter of fact, I was doing some research on corn. And Clint, I don't know if you've done gone all the way back on that maize. But I was reading some articles that stated that the predecessor to today's corn, which went all the way back to like 700 or 800 A.D., the corn itself, would skip 2 or 3 rows. It wasn't a full ear and whatever. And the Cherokees came up with a new variety called Eastern Flint. And Eastern Flint was the ancestor of all of our corn today. It was much more prolific and more full-eared and so forth. And so corn has been around a long, long time with a long history. Anybody else?
That's the original genetic modification.
Yeah.
The natural way.
Yeah.
On that note, I recently read a book called 1491, and I'd be curious if you have an opinion on that book. But, it poses that the eastern woodlands were entirely managed, if I understand it correctly, far more than we ever realized before, that the primordial wood that Thoreau writes about is the overgrowth of the result of the lack of management after so many Native Americans died from all the diseases of the white man.
Mm-hmm.
Is that book a kind of book
Yeah,
to rely on?
it's a good resource to have knowledge of. The meaning of domestication was misinterpreted.
Yeah.
People thought domestication meant farming and plot and kind of the Jeffersonian way of working with the land that way. And there was a lot more to domestication on a larger scale, having to do with controlled burning, other ways of manipulating certain resources in order to stimulate that production, encourage growth for the types of materials that you needed for it. So I think it was a misconception that this was a virgin wilderness. Going back to that word wilderness, it's a misconception or a different perspective looking at things in terms of being wild as opposed to being domesticated or managed by native peoples.
Yeah, we did those control burns too. One more question.
Well, yes, about where they had the gardens, they didn't have it. But a garden, a roll or
Right.
around this like that. This stuff that they used regularly, they took to the house there.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't formal garden. This was actually a garden of the stuff that they wanted
Right.
in the house.
Right. Mm-hmm. And they're so lucky to have a seed exchange here. How many of you take advantage of the seed exchange? That really is a real asset you've got here, a treasure. I tell you what, the way I feel about Cherokee Garden is that once you've collected your plants and you've got an educational garden, that garden is absolutely priceless. There's no amount of money in the world that can buy it. You can't go out and buy native plants. You can't go out and buy the heritage. But you certainly can get plugged into it, and you can really get hooked on the Cherokee plants and native plants and their history. Because when you go out and work with them, whether you're weeding or pruning or whatever you happen to be doing, you think about what that plant meant to your ancestors, and now, because of that, what it means to you. And your gardening will take on a totally unique and bigger perspective that you've never felt before. So I challenge you to do that. Let me give you a little bit of information on what we're going to do next. We're going to take about a 20-minute break. And then when we come back, Kara's going to come up and talk about starting your own Cherokee garden, resources that you can have to start your own Cherokee garden. And then after that, we're going to do a walkthrough of the Cherokee garden. Everybody know where that's at? It's over by the creek. What's the name?
We'll walk over.
Yeah. Okay. So and if you have any questions as we're going through the garden, I'll be happy to try to answer them for you. So we'll take about a 20-minute break and then come back, and Kara will wrap up.